With nowhere to live, two orphaned sisters come across a blind millionaire who was abandoned by his own family. While caring for him, they discover a secret that changes their destinies forever. The smell of antiseptic and disinfectant hung in the air, blending with the bitter aroma of stale coffee and the lingering odor of illness. In the cramped room of a public hospital, Sophie and Claire, identical twins just 5 years old, huddled together on an uncomfortable chair beside their mother's bed. Their large, fearful eyes darted between the pale, weary face of their only family member and the incessantly blinking monitors, as though they could decipher the secrets the adults whispered about in the hallways. Amelie, the girl's mother, had been battling a relentless cancer for months. Her body, once vibrant and full of life, was now reduced to a fragile shadow, almost transparent against the white hospital sheets. But her eyes, oh, her eyes, still shone with fierce love whenever she looked at her daughters. "My little warriors," she whispered, her voice hoarse and weak. Sophie and Claire leaned in closer, clinging to every word as if it were water in a desert. "Always remember, you're stronger together. Never separate, no matter what happens." The girls nodded solemnly, their tiny fingers interlaced, a silent promise made at that critical moment. They didn't fully understand what was happening, but they felt the weight of the situation in their young hearts. That night, while the moon cast ghostly shadows through the hospital window, Amelie slipped away quietly, leaving her sleeping daughters and Inautas irrevocably orphaned little girls. Dawn brought with it a cruel and relentless reality. Sophie was the first to wake, her sleepy eyes instinctively searching for her mother. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the steady, monotonous beep of the machine nearby. "Mommy," she called softly, her voice trembling. There was no answer. Claire stirred at her sister's movement, and together they faced the devastating truth. Silent tears rolled down their cheeks as they held each other, their small bodies shaking with suppressed sobs. The world around them burst into frantic motion. Nurses, doctors, and social workers came and went from the room, their voices a distant hum to the girls, who clung to one another as though their lives depended on it. What will happen to them? No relatives at all. They'll have to enter the system. Fragments of conversations drifted around them, words they didn't fully understand, but that carried a terrible weight. Hours later, still reeling from the loss, Sophie and Claire found themselves in the back seat of an official car, their belongings reduced to 2 small backpacks. The social worker in the front seat spoke gently, comforting words that barely penetrated the bubble of grief that surrounded the twins. The orphanage loomed ahead of them, a grey, imposing building that seemed to swallow the sky. The girls instinctively shrank back, their fingers interlacing more tightly. "Welcome to your new home, girls," said the orphanage director, a tall, thin woman with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You'll stay here until we find a family to adopt you." The days dragged on, each one longer and lonelier than the last. Sophie and Claire became silent shadows in the orphanage's corridors, moving in unison, communicating with glances and gentle touches. The other children watched them curiously, but kept their distance, as though the twins' pain was contagious. At night, curled up in a single narrow bed, they whispered promises and dreams to each other. "We'll get out of here one day, Sophie," Claire murmured, her eyes shining in the darkness. "We'll find a new home, just the 2 of us." Sophie nodded, squeezing her sister's hand. Together, always together. But life in the orphanage was harsh and unforgiving. Meals were meager, staff were overworked and often indifferent. Day after day, the twins watched as older children grew bitter and hopeless, while the younger ones were taken away for visits with potential adoptive parents, often never to return. One night, after a particularly difficult day when they'd been separated during chores, Sophie and Claire made a pact. "We can't stay here, Claire," Sophie whispered, her large eyes filled with determination. "We have to find a better place." Claire hesitated for a moment, fear visible on her face. "But where would we go? We don't know anything outside this place." Sophie squeezed her sister's hand. "Remember what Mommy always said, we're stronger together. We can do this, Claire. We just have to be brave." With pounding hearts and trembling hands, the twins began planning their escape. They watched the night guard's routines, memorized the security camera's blind spots, and set aside small portions of food from their already sparse meals. On the chosen night, with the new moon providing the darkness they needed, Sophie and Claire put their plan into action. Carrying their worn backpacks filled with clothes and the few memories they had of their mother, they slipped through the orphanage's silent corridors. Each creak of the wooden floor sounded like thunder in their ears. Every shadow seemed like a guard ready to catch them, but they persisted, guided by the promise of freedom and the hope of a better future. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they reached the orphanage's back wall. Claire gave Sophie a boost, who then helped her sister up. For a moment, they paused atop the wall, looking at the city that stretched out before them, a sea of lights and unknown possibilities. "We're really doing this," Claire whispered, her voice a mixture of fear and excitement. Sophie squeezed her sister's hand. "Together, remember? Always together." With one last glance at the orphanage that had been their home for the past few months, the twins jumped to freedom. Their feet hit the cold asphalt, and they ran, hand in hand, hearts pounding in unison, into the unknown. The city streets were a maze of shadows and lights, filled with sounds and smells unfamiliar to the girls, who had spent their short lives first shielded by their mother's love, and then by the orphanage's cold walls. But Sophie and Claire pressed on, driven by a raw survival instinct and the love they shared. They found shelter that first night in an abandoned playground, curled up inside a slide, their small forms trembling not only with cold, but also with fear and excitement. Dawn found them exhausted, but determined. "What do we do now, Sophie?" Claire asked, her wide eyes scanning the unfamiliar urban landscape. Sophie, feeling the weight of the responsibility she had taken on by suggesting they flee, swallowed hard before answering. "We'll find a safe place, Claire, a place where we can stay together and be happy, like Mommy wanted." And so began Sophie and Claire's journey through the city streets. Two small figures, hand in hand, facing a vast and often cruel world, armed only with their courage, their love for each other, and the memory of their mother's smile. They had no idea their fate was about to intertwine with that of a man who, like them, had been abandoned by life, an encounter that would change the course of their lives forever. The first rays of sunlight had barely begun to illuminate the city's dark alleys when Sophie and Claire woke, their bodies aching after yet another night sleeping on the hard ground of an alley. It had been a week since they had fled the orphanage, and each day brought new challenges and fears for the 5-year-old twins. Sophie was the first to get up, rubbing her sleepy eyes as she watched the street come to life. Street vendors were setting up their stalls, and the first cars began to appear, bringing with them the noise of the city waking up. "Claire," she whispered, gently shaking her sister. "We have to move." Claire grumbled softly but soon got up, survival on the streets having already taught them both the importance of always being on the move. The girls gathered their few belongings, 2 worn backpacks containing some clothes and their precious memories of their mother, and left the alley, blending into the crowd that was beginning to form on the sidewalks. Claire's stomach growled audibly, reminding them they hadn't had anything substantial to eat in days. They survived on scraps found in trash cans behind restaurants and occasionally on the kindness of strangers who, touched by the sight of 2 such young children alone, offered them a sandwich or a piece of fruit. "Sophie, I'm hungry," Claire murmured, her large eyes filled with sadness and exhaustion. Sophie squeezed her sister's hand, trying to convey a confidence she didn't truly feel. "I know, Claire. Let's try to find something to eat. Remember what Mommy always said. As long as we're together, we can overcome anything." The twins walked through the busy streets, their eyes alert for any opportunity to get food or find a safe place to rest. Fear was a constant companion, fear of being caught and sent back to the orphanage, fear of malicious adults, fear of the unknown lurking around every corner. Passing a bakery, the aroma of fresh bread made the girls' stomachs growl even louder. They stopped, watching through the window display as customers left with bags full of bread and pastries. "What if—" Claire began, but Sophie shook her head firmly. "We can't steal, Claire. Mommy would be sad." Claire nodded, resigned. Even in their deepest need, their mother's lessons remained etched in their hearts. They kept walking, hope fading with each step. That was when they heard a clattering sound and a muffled cry coming from a nearby alley. The girls exchanged a quick glance before rushing to investigate. In the alley, they found a middle-aged man sprawled on the ground, desperately feeling around him. His eyes, though open, seemed unfocused, and a pair of dark glasses lay broken a few steps away. "Please, can someone help me?" the man called, his voice trembling with fear and frustration. Sophie and Claire hesitated for a moment, years of warnings about not talking to strangers echoing in their minds. But something about the man's vulnerability touched their compassionate hearts. "Sir," Sophie said softly, approaching cautiously. "Are you okay?" The man turned his head toward the voice, a mixture of relief and apprehension on his face. "Oh, thank God." "Yes, I fell. I'm blind and my cane broke. Could you help me up?" Claire was already moving to pick up the broken glasses, while Sophie approached to offer her small arm as support. "Of course, sir. We can help," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Carefully, the twins helped the man to his feet. He was tall, well-dressed, with grey hair and a gentle expression, despite his obvious disorientation. "Thank you so much, kids," he said, smiling in the general direction of their voices. "My name is Thomas. May I know the names of my young rescuers?" "I'm Sophie, and this is my sister Claire," Sophie replied, still holding Thomas's arm to steady him. Thomas frowned, noticing something in Sophie's voice. "You both sound so young to be out here alone. Where are your parents?" The girls exchanged an anguished look, years of caution preventing them from fully trusting a stranger, even one who seemed so harmless. We're alone," Claire finally answered, her voice almost a whisper. Thomas fell silent for a moment, as though processing the information. When he spoke again, his voice was filled with compassion that made the girls' eyes fill with tears. "I see. Well, it looks like we're all a little lost today. How about you help me get home? In return, I can offer you a hot meal. I bet it's been a while since you've had something decent to eat, hasn't it?" The mention of food made the twins' stomachs rumble loudly, prompting a soft laugh from Thomas. "I guess that's a yes," he smiled. "Don't worry. I'm not going to hurt you. I just want to repay the kindness." Sophie and Claire looked at each other, a silent conversation passing between them. Years of caring for each other had made them experts in non-verbal communication. Finally, Sophie spoke. "We appreciate it, Mr. Thomas. We'll be happy to help you get home." And so the unlikely trio began their journey through the city streets. Thomas in the middle, one gentle hand resting on each girl's shoulder as they carefully guided him, warning him about obstacles and directing his steps. As they walked, Thomas chatted softly with the twins, his calm, kind voice gradually putting them at ease. He told funny stories about his life, carefully avoiding questions that might make them uncomfortable. In turn, Sophie and Claire began to open up a bit, sharing small details about their likes and dislikes, while still keeping their tragic story to themselves. By the time they reached Thomas's home, an imposing mansion in an upscale neighborhood, the girls were exhausted. But for the first time in days, they felt a spark of hope. "Well, here we are," Thomas announced, a warm smile on his face. "How about we go inside and see what we can cook? I'm sure we can find something delicious in the kitchen." Sophie and Claire hesitated at the entrance, years of caution clashing with their hunger and desire for safety and comfort. "It's okay," Thomas assured them gently, sensing their hesitation. "You can leave anytime you feel uncomfortable, but I would really like to thank you properly for your help." Finally, Sophie stepped forward, gently pulling Claire with her. "Thank you, Mr. Thomas. We'd be happy to accept your offer." As they entered the house, none of them could have imagined how that chance encounter would change their lives forever. For Thomas, two small lights had entered his world of darkness. For Sophie and Claire, a beacon of hope had emerged from the despair of their young lives. Fate, in its mysterious wisdom, had woven together the paths of these three lonely souls, laying the groundwork for a journey of healing, love and redemption that was only just beginning. 6 months earlier, Thomas Blackwell woke up in his king-size bed, stretching languidly under Egyptian silk sheets. As on every morning for the last 30 years, He expected the sunlight streaming through expensive drapes to fill his luxurious bedroom. But today something was wrong, very wrong. He blinked once, twice, 3 times. Nothing, only darkness. It must still be very early, he thought, trying to calm the rising panic in his chest. He fumbled on the nightstand for his watch and pressed the button to hear the time. 8:15 a.m., announced the robotic voice. Thomas's heart raced. It should already be light out. He got up abruptly, staggering toward the window. His hands trembled as he pulled the curtains aside, desperately hoping the light would flood his eyes. Nothing changed. The darkness persisted. No, 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 he murmured, panic finally taking hold. This can't be happening. The next few hours passed in a blur of fear and confusion. Doctors were called, tests were done, diagnoses delivered in grave tones. The conclusion was as simple as it was devastating. Thomas had lost his sight overnight, the victim of a rare condition doctors referred to as sudden blindness. Sitting in his office, now plunged into eternal darkness, Thomas tried to process the news. At 50 years old, at the peak of his career as one of the most successful business tycoons in the country, his life had changed irrevocably in a matter of hours. The door opened, and he heard the familiar footsteps of his children, Anne and Paul. "Dad," Anne's tense voice reached him. "We heard the news." "How are you holding up?" Thomas turned toward the voice, his now useless eyes staring into emptiness. "How do you think I'm doing? I just lost my sight." Paul cleared his throat awkwardly. "Dad, we need to discuss the implications of this for the company, for everything." Thomas felt a pang of disappointment, not a word of comfort, only practical concerns. "What do you mean?" "Well," Anne began, hesitant, "obviously you can't keep running the company in this condition. Maybe it's time to consider transferring control." The silence that followed was deafening. Thomas couldn't see his children's faces, but he could sense the poorly disguised greed in their voices. "Get out," he finally said, his voice low and dangerous. "Get out now." The following weeks were a nightmare for Thomas. Far from offering support, his children began pressuring him more and more to relinquish control of his company and assets. Their visits, once rare, became frequent and tense. A month after losing his sight, Thomas was seated in his office, trying to familiarize himself with a Braille reading system when he heard a heated argument in the hallway. "You can't do this," it was Martha's voice, his longtime housekeeper. "Mr. Blackwell needs you more than ever right now." "Stay out of this, Martha," Paul's cutting voice responded. "Our father is no longer fit to make decisions. We're doing what's best for everyone." The office door was flung open. Thomas raised his head, exhaustion etched on his face. "Dad," Anne spoke, her voice sickly sweet, "we've come to get you. We found a wonderful place where you'll receive all the care you need." Thomas felt his heart sink. "What are you talking about, Anne?" "An assisted living facility, Dad," Paul explained, impatient. "It's what's best for you. You'll have all the assistance you need there." Thomas sat in silence for a long moment, the reality of his children's betrayal finally settling in. When he spoke, his voice was filled with disappointment and anger. "You want to put me away so you can take everything, don't you?" "Dad, be reasonable," Anne pleaded, but Thomas could hear the falseness in her voice. "Get out of my house," he growled. "You are no longer my children." What followed was a heated argument, with Anne and Paul trying to convince and then force Thomas to come with them. In the midst of the chaos, Thomas managed to slip away, thundering orders at Martha to lock the doors and not let his children in again. Exhausted and heartbroken, Thomas locked himself in his room, his children's cruel words echoing in his mind. It was there, alone in the darkness, that he made a drastic decision. The next morning, before dawn, Thomas slipped out of his own house, taking only a cane and a small suitcase. He left a note for Martha, asking her not to look for him. Determined to prove to himself and the world that he could survive without his greedy children's help, he ventured into the city streets, a blind, lost millionaire. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, George, Thomas's loyal butler, was enjoying the last days of his long-overdue vacation. Sitting in a London cafe, he was distractedly flipping through a newspaper when a headline caught his attention. Business magnate disappears after losing his sight. George's blood ran cold at the sight of Thomas's name and photo. Panicking, he immediately packed his bags and rushed to the airport, determined to return home and find out what had happened to his employer and friend. Days later, George arrived at the mansion to find it in a state of contained chaos. Martha, her eyes red from crying, told him about Thomas's sudden blindness, his children's greed, and his mysterious disappearance. "He just left," Martha sobbed. "He left a note saying not to look for him. Oh, George, what are we going to do?" George, feeling the weight of responsibility on his shoulders, placed a comforting hand on Martha's shoulder. "We're going to find him, Martha. No matter how long it takes, we'll bring Mr. Blackwell home." While George began his tireless search, Thomas roamed the city streets, lost not only in physical darkness, but in the darkness of his wounded soul. Little did he know that his destiny was about to intersect with that of two small orphans, an encounter that would forever change the course of all their lives. The sun was beginning to set as Thomas, Sophie, and Claire arrived at the abandoned building. Once impressive, the structure now stood like a decaying giant in a forgotten part of town. The broken windows resembled hollow eyes watching the street, and the peeling concrete silently told stories of past glories. "Is this where you live?" Thomas asked hesitantly, gripping the improvised cane the girls had found for him a bit tighter. Sophie and Claire exchanged apprehensive looks before Sophie answered, "Yes, Mr. Thomas. It's safe, and no one bothers us here." Thomas nodded slowly, a lump forming in his throat at the thought of two children so young considering an abandoned building home. Carefully, the twins guided Thomas through the rubble at the entrance, their small hands tightly holding his. The interior was cold and damp, the smell of mold and neglect hanging in the air. "Watch out for the broken step, Mr. Thomas," Claire cautioned, her voice echoing in the empty space. They slowly climbed to the third floor, where the girls had set up a small refuge. An old mattress occupied one corner, covered with a few tattered blankets. Cardboard boxes served as makeshift furniture, and a pile of books salvaged from nearby trash bins provided a surreal touch of normalcy. "Well, this is it," Sophie announced, a hint of pride in her voice. "It's not much, but it's perfect," Thomas interrupted, his voice thick with emotion. He couldn't see the place, but he could feel the girls' effort and courage in every detail they described. In the days that followed, a strange but comforting routine settled among the unlikely trio. The girls, used to taking care of each other, found themselves also caring for Thomas. They guided him through the streets when they needed to search for food or supplies, always alert to possible dangers. Thomas, for his part, used his knowledge and experience to help the girls survive. He taught them how to identify safe places to ask for food, to avoid dangerous areas of the city, and shared stories and lessons that kept their minds engaged. One evening, while sharing a meager meal donated by a local charity, Claire timidly asked, "Mr. Thomas, did you have a family before you went blind?" The silence that followed was heavy, laden with unspoken emotions. Finally, Thomas replied in a low, sad voice, "Yes, Claire, I did. But sometimes the family you choose is more genuine than the one you're given by blood." Sophie and Claire instinctively moved closer to Thomas, offering the silent comfort of their presence. In that moment, all three felt that, despite their terrible circumstances, they had found something precious in each other. Days on the streets were harsh and unpredictable. Sometimes they managed to gather a few coins by doing small chores. Thomas would play guitar on a street corner while the girls sang, or they would help carry bags at a local market. Other times, they relied on the kindness of strangers or on restaurant leftovers. As winter approached, it brought with it new difficulties. The nights grew longer and colder, and the biting wind seeped through the broken windows of the abandoned building. Thomas began coughing, a deep, concerning sound that echoed through the night's silence. "We need more blankets," Sophie murmured one night, her teeth chattering as she huddled closer to Claire and Thomas for warmth. "And medicine for Mr. Thomas," Claire added, worry evident in her childish voice. Thomas tried to smile, but it turned into another cough. "Don't worry about me, girls. I've been through worse winters." But the twins were not fooled. The next morning, determined to help their protector, they set out early, promising Thomas they would return soon with food and, hopefully, something for his cough. Hours dragged on, and Thomas became increasingly anxious. The streets were dangerous for two little girls alone. He knew that. As the sun began to set and the girls still hadn't returned, panic took hold of him. With great effort, Thomas stood, grabbed his cane, and for the first time since arriving there, ventured outside the building on his own. The darkness that enveloped him felt even heavier on these unfamiliar streets, but his fear for Sophie and Claire drove him onward. "Sophie, Claire," he called, his raspy voice echoing through deserted streets. People passed him by. Some glanced at him with pity, others simply ignored him. Meanwhile, not too far away, Sophie and Claire were racing back to the abandoned building, their arms loaded with bread donated by a sympathetic bakery and a small bottle of cough syrup they had obtained at a charity clinic. Arriving at the building and not finding Thomas, panic set in. "He must have gone out looking for us," Sophie concluded, fear evident in her voice. The girls returned to the now dark and even more threatening streets, calling out for Thomas. The city felt like a giant maze, full of dangers and uncertainty. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they heard a familiar voice. "Sophie!" "Claire!" Running toward the sound, they found Thomas exhausted and trembling, leaning against a wall. Relief shone on the girls' faces as they threw themselves into his arms. "Never do that again," Thomas murmured, holding them tight. "I was so worried." "We were worried about you," Claire replied, tears in her eyes. "We brought medicine for you." That night, back in their makeshift home, as Thomas took the cough syrup and the girls shared the bread, a silent resolution was made among them. No matter how hard it might be, they would face it together. They were a family now, not joined by blood, but by adversity and the love they had found in one another. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, George continued his tireless search, unaware of how close he was to finding his long-lost friend. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Winter arrived in full force, bringing relentless snowstorms and freezing temperatures. In the old abandoned building, Thomas, Sophie, and Claire fought not only to survive, but to build something resembling a home. Every morning, Thomas woke before the girls. Even though he couldn't see, he developed a routine, carefully navigating the space, checking the broken windows they had covered with pieces of cardboard and plastic, and trying to light a small makeshift stove to heat some water. "Good morning, Mr. Thomas." Sophie's sleepy voice was always the first to break the morning silence. "Good morning, my little one," Thomas replied with a smile, the affection evident in his voice. "Is Claire still asleep?" A loud yawn answered the question, followed by Claire's soft voice. "I'm awake, just still a bit sleepy." These quiet mornings became precious to the trio. While sharing whatever they had for breakfast, sometimes just a piece of stale bread or some bruised fruit, they discussed their plans for the day. It was during one of these mornings that Thomas had an idea. "Girls," he began hesitantly, "did you go to school before all this happened?" Sophie and Claire exchanged glances. "A little bit," Sophie answered. "But it's been a while." Thomas nodded, a determined expression on his face. "Well, we can't let your brilliant minds go to waste, can we? How about we have our own school here?" The twins' eyes lit up at the suggestion. "You'd be our teacher?" Claire asked, excited. "Well, I'll do my best," Thomas chuckled. "I might not be able to see, but I still have plenty of knowledge to share." And so began the Academy of the Abandoned Building, as Claire affectionately called it. Every morning, after breakfast, Thomas would sit with the girls and teach them whatever he could. Math lessons were taught using pebbles and sticks as counting aids. History came to life through Thomas's fascinating stories. For science, they took small outings to the nearby park, where Thomas taught them about plants and animals, guided by the girls' detailed descriptions. "Look at this," Thomas would say, holding a leaf Claire had placed in his hand. "You can feel the veins, can't you? They're like the veins in our bodies, carrying nutrients throughout the plant." Sophie and Claire listened intently, soaking up every word. Their hunger for knowledge seemed insatiable, and Thomas delighted in feeding it. Reading lessons were particularly special. Thomas couldn't read to them, but he encouraged the girls to read aloud from the books they had found. Sometimes they stumbled over difficult words, and Thomas would gently correct them, explaining their meanings. "So, feisty-catted," Sophie read slowly. "What does that mean, Mr. Thomas?" "Ah, sophisticated," Thomas smiled. "It means something refined, elegant. Like you two, my little sophisticated ladies." The girls giggled, delighted at the idea of being sophisticated in the midst of their life on the streets. As the days went by, the bond between them grew stronger. Thomas, once a hardened businessman, found himself melting under the unconditional love of the girls. Sophie and Claire, in turn, thrived under Thomas's care and guidance. One night, as they huddled together to keep warm, Claire timidly asked, "Mr. Thomas, do you think we'll ever have a real house one day?" Thomas fell silent for a moment, his heart heavy. He knew he could easily provide a house for them. His fortune was still there, after all. But the fear of being found by his greedy children, the fear of losing Sophie and Claire to the system, paralyzed him. "One day, my dear," he finally replied, his voice gentle. "One day we'll have a home, I promise." Sensing the emotion in Thomas's voice, Sophie changed the subject. "Mr. Thomas, can you tell us more about the stars? They're so bright tonight." Thomas smiled, grateful for the distraction. "Ah, the stars. Did you know that ancient sailors used them to navigate? They would look to the sky and—" While Thomas spoke, painting pictures of constellations and distant galaxies with his words, Sophie and Claire snuggled closer to him. In that moment, despite the cold and the hunger and the daily hardships, they felt safe and loved. Winter raged outside, merciless, but inside that abandoned building, an unlikely family had formed. Bound by adversity, strengthened by love and sustained by hope, Thomas, Sophie, and Claire faced each day together, creating memories and forging bonds that no storm could break. As spring approached, bringing the promise of warmer days and new possibilities, the trio knew that whatever the future held, they would face it together. For they had found something precious in each other. Spring had arrived, carrying an air of renewal and hope. The first rays of morning sunlight crept through the boarded-up windows of the abandoned building, illuminating the small space that Thomas, Sophie, and Claire now called home. Thomas woke to the sound of birds singing, a sound he hadn't heard in months. He sat up slowly, his aching bones protesting another night on the hard floor. Beside him, he could hear the soft breathing of the girls, still asleep. While waiting for them to wake, Thomas reflected on the past months. Winter had been brutal, testing them in every possible way. There had been days when the hunger was so intense it hurt, nights so cold he feared they wouldn't see morning. But they had survived, together. More than that, they had become a family. Thomas smiled at the thought of how familiar the girls' voices had become, like his own breath. He knew every inflection, every laugh, every sigh, and they, in turn, had learned to read his expressions, to understand his silences. But now that spring had arrived, Thomas felt it was time for a change. They couldn't go on living like this indefinitely. The girls deserved more, a real home, proper education, a chance in life. And for that, he would have to face his past. "Good morning, Mr. Thomas." Sophie's sleepy voice broke his thoughts. "Good morning, my dear," he replied with a smile. "Is Claire still sleeping?" An audible yawn answered his question. "Not anymore," Claire murmured, rubbing her eyes. As the girls stretched and got up, Thomas took a deep breath. "Girls, there's something I need to talk to you about today." The serious tone in his voice caught the twins' attention. They sat close to him, their small hands instinctively finding his. "What is it, Mr. Thomas?" Sophie asked, concern evident in her voice. Thomas hesitated for a moment, searching for the right words. "Do you remember when you asked me about my life before we met? Well, I think it's time I told you the whole truth." He paused, summoning his courage. "Before I lost my sight and ended up on the streets, I was a very wealthy man." The girls remained silent, absorbing the information. Thomas continued. "I owned a big company, a mansion, expensive cars, everything money could buy. But I also had 2 grown children, Anne and Paul. When I suddenly went blind, they didn't react well. Thomas told the girls about his children's greed, how they had tried to put him in an assisted living facility to gain control of his fortune. He described his desperate escape, living on the streets to prove he could fend for himself. But then, he smiled, gently squeezing the girl's hands, I found you two, and for the first time in a long while, I felt truly rich again. Sophie and Claire listened intently, their young faces a mixture of surprise and understanding. Mr. Thomas, Claire finally spoke, her voice trembling slightly. Why are you telling us this now? Thomas sighed. Because I think it's time we go back. Not to the life I had before, but to something better than this. You girls deserve more than an abandoned building and uncertain meals. You deserve a real home, school, a chance to grow up safe and happy. He paused, swallowing the lump in his throat. But before we make that decision, I need to know if you trust me enough to do this. And I need to know more about you, about how you ended up on the streets. The silence that followed was heavy. Thomas could feel the tension in the girls' hands, heard their breaths quicken. Finally, Sophie spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Our mum died a few months ago. Cancer. We don't have anyone else. Claire continued the story, explaining about the orphanage, the fear and their desperate flight. Thomas listened, his heart breaking with every word. When they finished, tears had gathered in all their eyes. Oh, my dears, Thomas murmured, pulling them into a tight embrace. I'm so sorry for everything you've been through. They stayed like that for a long time, an embrace that offered as much solace as it did promise. When they finally parted, Thomas spoke again. I know this is a lot to take in, and I understand if you need time to think it over, but I want you to know, if we decide to return, I promise I'll do everything in my power to give you the home and family you deserve. It won't be easy. I'll have to face my children, deal with legal matters, maybe even fight for custody of you both. But I'll do it all, if you want me to. Sophie and Claire looked at each other, a silent conversation passing between them. Then, to Thomas's surprise, they both let out soft laughter. Mr. Thomas, Sophie said, a smile in her voice. You're already our family. It doesn't matter where we live. That's right, Claire agreed, but a real bed and regular meals wouldn't be so bad. Thomas laughed, feeling his heart fill with love and gratitude. So, are we decided? Shall we take this new adventure together? Yes, the girls answered in unison, throwing their arms around Thomas again. That night, as they prepared to sleep one last time in the abandoned building, a sense of anticipation filled the air. Thomas knew the road ahead would be hard. He would have to confront his past, fight against his children's greed, navigate the legal system to keep Sophie and Claire with him. But looking ahead, he felt no fear. Mr. Thomas, Claire's sleepy voice broke the silence. Yes, dear. I'm glad you told us the truth, and I'm glad we'll stay together. Thomas smiled, tears pricking at his eyes. Me too, my dear, me too. While the girls drifted off to sleep, Thomas stayed awake, planning the steps to come. Tomorrow would mark the beginning of a new journey, full of challenges but also filled with hope. A journey he would face not alone, but with two little warriors at his side. And so, under the star-filled spring sky, this unlikely family dreamed of the future, bound by ties stronger than blood, ties of love, trust, and the promise of better days ahead. The sun had barely risen when George left his small apartment, determination etched on his wrinkled face. For months he had followed the same routine: wake before dawn, drink a strong coffee, and head out to the streets, always searching for his missing friend and employer, Thomas Blackwell. George adjusted his worn hat and pulled his coat tighter against the morning chill. His steps were firm, echoing on the still empty sidewalks of downtown. Today, he muttered to himself, as he did every morning. Today I'm going to find him. The loyal butler had served the Blackwell family for over 3 decades. He had witnessed Thomas build his empire from scratch, seen the birth and growth of Anne and Paul, and stood by his employer through moments of joy and sorrow. For George, the Blackwells were more than employers. They were family. When he returned from his vacation to find that Thomas had disappeared, George felt as though the ground had been pulled from beneath his feet. The mansion, once full of life, was silent and cold. Anne and Paul had taken control of the company, claiming their father was incapacitated by his sudden blindness. But George knew Thomas. He knew that Thomas would never abandon everything without a good reason. That morning, as on many others, George started his search at the local homeless shelters. He entered each one, holding up a worn photo of Thomas, hoping someone might recognize him. "I'm sorry, sir," said a volunteer at one shelter. "I haven't seen anyone like him around here." George thanked the volunteer politely and moved on. His next stop was the local hospital. Perhaps Thomas had been admitted for some reason and was unable to get in touch. At the hospital, while he was speaking to a nurse at the reception desk, George overheard a conversation that caught his attention. "Did you see that report about the blind millionaire who disappeared?" a female voice remarked. "Oh, yes," replied another. "They say his kids are desperate to find him." George turned discreetly, straining his ears. "Desperate to get their hands on his fortune? More like," the first voice said cynically. George's heart pounded. He had always suspected Anne and Paul's motives, but hearing others voice the same doubts alarmed him. Leaving the hospital, George decided to change his approach. If he wanted to find Thomas, maybe he should investigate the children's actions more closely. With that new objective, George headed to the city's financial district. The impressive tower housing Blackwell Enterprises stood against the sky, a monument to Thomas's success. George observed the building's entrance for a while, watching well-dressed executives come and go. He knew every corner of that building, every hallway, every meeting room. But now, dressed in simple clothes, he felt like an outsider. Summoning his courage, he entered the lobby. The security guard at the reception desk eyed him warily. "Can I help you, sir?" the man asked, his hand discreetly moving toward the alarm button under the counter. George smiled, trying to appear as harmless as possible. "Yes, please. I'm George Wilkins, the former butler to the Blackwell family. I'd like to speak with Miss Anne or Mr. Paul, if possible." The guard frowned, clearly hesitant. "Wait a moment, please." While the man made a call, George surveyed the lobby. He noticed subtle changes in the decor, the company's logo slightly altered. It was as though Anne and Paul were trying to erase Thomas's presence. "Mr. Wilkins," the guard finally called, "I'm sorry, but the Blackwells are not available at the moment. They asked that you schedule a visit through their secretary." George nodded, thanking him politely. He knew it was just an excuse. Anne and Paul simply didn't want to see him. Leaving the building, George felt a mix of frustration and renewed determination building inside him. He needed more information, and he knew exactly where to get it. His next stop was a small cafe across the street. There, Marta, once a janitor at Blackwell Enterprises, worked, and George knew her well. "George!" Marta exclaimed when she saw him enter. "It's been so long." "What brings you here?" George sat at the counter ordering a coffee. "Hello, Marta. Actually, I'm looking for information about Mr. Thomas. Have you heard anything?" Marta's face turned serious. She looked around, making sure no one was listening, then leaned closer. "George, things haven't been right over there," she whispered. "Ever since Mr. Thomas, well, since he disappeared, his kids have been doing strange things." "What kind of strange things?" George asked, his heart pounding. Marta hesitated before continuing. "I've heard rumors of documents being destroyed, contracts being altered. And there's more. It seems they're siphoning money from the company into personal accounts." George felt the blood run cold in his veins. His suspicions were confirmed, and the situation was worse than he'd feared. "Marta, do you have any proof of this?" She shook her head. "Nothing concrete, but I have a friend who still works there. She said she could gather some documents if it's really important." George nodded gravely. "It's more important than you can imagine, Marta. Ask her to get whatever she can. I'll come back in a few days to pick it up." As he left the cafe, George's mind raced. If Anne and Paul were indeed committing fraud, it explained why Thomas had vanished so suddenly. Maybe he'd discovered something and had to disappear. Over the following days, George continued his street-level search with a renewed sense of urgency. He visited soup kitchens, free clinics, anywhere Thomas might have gone for help. A week later, he returned to Marta's cafe, She discreetly handed him an envelope. "This is everything my friend could gather," she said quietly. "Be careful, George. This is pure dynamite." That night, in his small apartment, George examined the documents. What he found horrified him. There was clear evidence of embezzlement, fraudulent contracts, and even attempts to alter Thomas's will. "Oh, Thomas," George murmured, tears in his eyes. "What have your own children done?" Now he fully understood why Thomas had disappeared, but this made his mission even more crucial. He had to find Thomas before it was too late, before Anne and Paul destroyed everything their father had built. With renewed determination, George stored the documents in a safe place. Tomorrow, he would resume his search with redoubled effort. Somewhere in this vast city, Thomas was waiting to be found, and George would not rest until he brought him back safely. As he prepared for bed, George looked out over the city lights. "I'm coming, old friend," he whispered into the night. "Just hold on a little longer." With these thoughts, George fell asleep, dreaming of the day he would finally find Thomas, and together they would confront the wrongs that had been done. The battle was just beginning, but George was ready to fight to the end. The morning sun had barely begun to bathe the city's rooftops in gold when George left his apartment. Determination once again etched on his lined face. Today was the day. He felt it in his bones, an inexplicable certainty that pulsed in his chest. Following a tip from a street vendor who claimed to have seen a blind man accompanied by two small girls, George headed to a rundown neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. The streets were quiet, with only a few homeless people awakening from makeshift shelters. George walked slowly, eyes scanning every movement, every shadow. His heart pounded with a mix of hope and anxiety. What if the tip was false? What if Thomas didn't want to be found? Then he heard it, a familiar voice, deep and kind, floating through the cool morning air. George froze, straining his ears to determine where it was coming from. "Very good, Sophie. Now, Claire, it's your turn. What is the capital of France?" "Paris," a little girl replied cheerfully. Tears sprang to George's eyes. It was unmistakably Thomas. Following the sound of their voices, he approached an abandoned building. He hesitated a moment before stepping inside, his heart hammering in his chest. On the third floor, he found a slightly open door. Taking a deep breath, George pushed it gently. The scene that greeted him stole his breath away. Thomas was sitting on the floor, two small girls at his side. Despite his disheveled appearance and worn clothes, there was a glow about him that George hadn't seen in years. "Thomas!" George called softly, his voice trembling with emotion. Time seemed to freeze. Thomas jerked his head toward the voice, his expression a mixture of shock and disbelief. "George," he whispered, as if afraid this was a hallucination. "Is it really you?" The girls looked from Thomas to George, confusion and fear evident in their young faces. George stepped forward, tears now streaming freely down his face. "Yes, my old friend. It's me. I finally found you." Thomas rose unsteadily, his hands outstretched. George rushed to him, pulling him into a tight embrace. They stayed like that for a long moment, silent sobs shaking their bodies. "I've been looking for you for so long," George murmured, his voice choked with emotion. "I thought I'd lost you forever." Thomas pulled back slightly, a shaky smile on his lips. "Oh, George, my loyal George, I should have known you wouldn't give up." The girls, still wary, approached. Sophie, the braver one, gently tugged on Thomas's sleeve. "Mr. Thomas?" she asked tentatively. "Who is he?" Thomas turned toward the girls, extending a hand to them. "Sophie, Claire, this is George. He's my oldest and dearest friend." George looked at the girls, noticing their thin faces and shabby clothes. His heart clenched at the thought of what they must have endured. "Hello, girls," he said softly, kneeling to their level. "It's a pleasure to meet you." Claire, the more timid, half hid behind Thomas, but Sophie took a small step forward. "Did you come to take Mr. Thomas away?" she asked, a trace of fear in her voice. George glanced at Thomas, unsure of how to respond. Thomas, sensing the tension, gave a gentle smile. "Girls," he began, "remember when I told you about my life before we met? George was part of that life. He's like family to me." The girls relaxed a bit at this explanation. George, perceiving the dynamic between them, felt a surge of admiration for Thomas. Even in the direst circumstances, his friend had found a way to form connections, to create a family. "Thomas," George said, his voice serious, "we have a lot to discuss. About Anne, Paul, the company." Thomas nodded solemnly. "I suspected. But first, George, we need to take care of these girls. They're orphans, and I promised them a home." George looked again at Sophie and Claire, seeing the mixture of hope and fear in their young eyes. In that moment, he understood why Thomas had chosen to remain on the streets rather than return. "Well," George said, a smile spreading across his face, "it seems we have a lot of work ahead of us, don't we?" Thomas laughed, a sound of pure relief and joy. "Oh, George, you have no idea how good it is to hear you say that." In the hours that followed, George listened to the full story of Thomas and the girls. He told Thomas about his discoveries, about Anne and Paul's fraudulent actions. Thomas listened in silence, his expression a mixture of sadness and resolve. As the day wore on, plans began to take shape. George insisted they all go back to his apartment at once. "It's not large," he said, "but it's clean, warm, and safe." While they prepared to leave, Sophie timidly approached George. "Mr. George," she said softly, "are you going to separate us from Mr. Thomas?" George knelt again, looking directly into the little girl's eyes. "Sophie, I promise you and Claire, I will do everything in my power to keep you three together. You're a family now, and families should stay together." Sophie's eyes filled with tears, and to George's surprise, she hugged him tightly. "Thank you, Mr. George," she whispered. When they finally left the abandoned building, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Thomas walked between Sophie and Claire, each girl holding one of his hands. George followed behind, carrying what few possessions they had. Watching the group in front of him, George felt a wave of mixed emotions. Relief at having found Thomas, anger at what Anne and Paul had done, and a fierce determination to protect this new and unlikely family. He knew the road ahead would be difficult. There would be legal battles, emotional confrontations, countless obstacles. But looking at Thomas, seeing the evident love on his face as he spoke softly with the girls, George knew it would all be worth it. As they walked through the city streets, heading toward an uncertain but hopeful future, George made a silent promise. He would protect this family with everything he had. Thomas, Sophie, and Claire had found each other under the most unlikely circumstances, and now George would join that bond. Their reunion was not just the end of a long search, but the beginning of a new journey, a journey of healing, justice, and above all, love. And together, they would face whatever storms lay ahead. George's modest apartment had never seemed so full of life. Thomas was seated on a threadbare sofa, with Sophie and Claire snuggled close on either side. George occupied a worn armchair, leaning forward, his hands clasped as he spoke in a low, intense voice. "Thomas, the situation is serious," George began, worry etched on his features. "Anne and Paul, they've gone further than we imagined." Thomas nodded gravely, his face calm but his hands tensing around the girl's shoulders. "Tell me everything, George. Leave nothing out." George took a deep breath before continuing. "They've taken full control of the company. They're siphoning funds, altering contracts. They even tried to modify your will." A heavy silence fell over the room. Sophie and Claire looked from George to Thomas, their eyes wide at the palpable tension. "Mr. Thomas," Claire asked timidly, "are you okay?" Thomas forced a smile, gently running a hand over the girl's hair. "I'll be fine, sweetheart. We're going to fix this," George went on, detailing the evidence he'd gathered, the suspicions of employees and the rumors circulating in the corridors of the company. With each revelation, Thomas's face grew darker. "What about the mansion?" Thomas finally asked. George hesitated. They've changed it." "Thomas, redecorated, sold off some of your collections. It's like they're trying to erase your presence." Thomas closed his eyes, the pain evident on his face. Sophie, sensing his distress, squeezed his hand. "We can help, Mr. Thomas," she said with determination. "You taught us so much. Maybe we can use that now." Thomas smiled, genuinely touched by the offer. "Thank you, Sophie. You both helped me more than you know just by being here." George observed the interaction with a mix of admiration and concern. It was clear how deeply Thomas cared for the girls and how they, in turn, relied on him. But it was equally clear that the path ahead would be fraught with challenges. "Thomas," George said softly, "we need to plan our next steps carefully. Anne and Paul won't give up the control they've gained so easily." Thomas nodded, his expression once again determined. "You're right, George. But before we face my children, we need to ensure Sophie and Claire's safety." The next few hours were spent drafting a meticulous plan. George suggested contacting a trustworthy lawyer to begin the legal proceedings necessary for Thomas to obtain custody of the girls. "It'll be a tough battle," George warned. "You're legally blind and you've been missing for months. They might question your ability to care for the girls. Then we'll prove to them I'm more than capable," Thomas responded firmly. "Sophie, Claire, would you be willing to speak to a judge about our life together?" The girls exchanged glances and then nodded vigorously. "We'll do anything to stay with you," Claire declared in a small but resolute voice. The next step was planning their return to the mansion. George had maintained contact with a few loyal staff members who would keep him informed of Anne and Paul's movements. "We need to catch them by surprise," George explained. "If they find out you're back, Thomas, they might hide evidence, or worse." Thomas agreed. "You're right. We need to be cautious but also quick. Every day that passes is another day they can do irreparable damage to the company and the legacy I built." While the adults talked strategy, Sophie and Claire listened intently, occasionally offering surprisingly insightful suggestions. Thomas couldn't help but feel proud of how much the girls had grown and matured over the past few months. "What about the press?" Sophie suddenly asked. "Won't they report on it when Mr. Thomas comes back?" George and Thomas were momentarily stunned by her astute question. "She's right," George said, impressed. "We need to control the narrative, or Anne and Paul could try to spin the story in their favor." They decided to make a controlled announcement to the press, revealing Thomas's return and introducing Sophie and Claire as his wards. Not only would it give them control of the narrative, but it would also put public pressure on Anne and Paul. As the night wore on, the details of the plan solidified. George would return to the mansion first, pretending it was just a routine visit. He'd assess the situation and give Thomas and the girls the green light to come. "Remember," Thomas told the girls, "when we get there, things might get confusing and scary. But I promise you, no matter what happens, we'll face it together." Sophie and Claire threw their arms around Thomas, their small forms trembling with a mixture of fear and excitement. George watched the scene with a lump in his throat. "Thomas," he said quietly, "you know this won't be easy. Anne and Paul, they're your children. Are you prepared for what might happen?" Thomas was silent for a moment, his face a storm of conflicting emotions. "They'll always be my children, George," he finally said, "but I can't ignore what they've done. And now," he gently hugged Sophie and Claire, "I have a new family to protect." The hours that followed were spent finalizing details. George made discreet calls, preparing the ground for Thomas's return. Thomas spent time with the girls, emotionally preparing them for what was to come. When they finally went to bed, the apartment fell into a silence charged with anticipation. Thomas lay awake, his mind replaying every detail of the plan. Beside him, Sophie and Claire slept peacefully, their soft breathing a constant reminder of what was at stake. In the darkness of the room, Thomas made a silent vow. No matter what happened, he would protect these girls. They had become his beacons of hope in a dark world, and he would do whatever it took to ensure their future. As sleep finally overtook him, Thomas allowed himself a moment of optimism. Tomorrow would mark the start of a new chapter, a chapter of redemption, justice, and above all, family. With George at his side and Sophie and Claire in his heart, he was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The return to Blackwell Mansion was about to begin, and with it, a battle that would change their lives forever. The sun had barely risen when a taxi pulled up quietly at the imposing gates of Blackwell Mansion. George, impeccably dressed in his old butler's uniform, was the first to step out. With a discreet nod to the driver, He helped Thomas out of the vehicle, followed by Sophie and Claire. Thomas, now clean-shaven and wearing a well-tailored suit, seemed to have reclaimed some of his old bearing. Even blind, he carried himself with a dignity that made the girls gaze at him with renewed admiration. "Are we ready?" George asked softly, his hand on Thomas's shoulder. Thomas took a deep breath, nodding. "As ready as I'll ever be." Sophie and Claire, dressed in simple but clean clothes, held each other's hands, their eyes wide at the sight of the mansion towering before them. "It's so big," Claire whispered, her voice a mixture of awe and apprehension. George gave the girls a kind smile. "Don't worry, you'll get used to it soon enough." With resolute steps, George led the group to the front door. He paused momentarily before using his old key, which he'd never had the heart to return. The click of the lock echoed in the morning silence like a gunshot. As they entered the foyer, they were greeted by the familiar scent of polished furniture and fresh flowers. Thomas inhaled deeply, memories flooding his mind. "Some things never change," he murmured. The sound of hurried footsteps from the corridor alerted the group. Anne, wearing a silk robe, was the first to appear, her face a mask of shock at the sight of the father she believed she had lost. "Dad?" she gasped, rooted to the spot. Before Thomas could reply, Paul emerged behind his sister, his eyes widening at the scene before him. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his voice alternating between surprise and irritation. Thomas took a step forward, his expression serious but composed. "Anne, Paul, I believe we have a lot to talk about." The silence that followed was deafening. Anne and Paul glanced at each other, then at their father, who they'd believed incapacitated, at George Boy, who seemed to have stepped out of the past, and at the two unfamiliar girls clinging to Thomas's hands. Anne finally broke the silence, her voice trembling. "Dad, we thought you had disappeared, died, perhaps." Thomas finished, his voice carrying a dangerous calm. "I imagine that might have been convenient for you." Paul moved forward defensively. "Now hold on a minute. We looked for you. We did everything we could." "Did you really, Paul?" George interjected, his usually gentle voice now sharp as a blade. "Including siphoning funds from the company and trying to alter your father's will?" Paul's face went visibly pale, while Anne raised a hand to her mouth to stifle a gasp. Thomas, sensing the growing tension, gently squeezed Sophie and Claire's shoulders. "Girls, why don't you go with George? I'm sure he can show you somewhere more comfortable to wait while I talk to my children." The twins hesitated, obviously reluctant to leave Thomas alone. "It'll be all right," Thomas assured them with a gentle smile. "I'll be with you soon." George guided the girls out of the foyer, casting a significant look at Thomas before leaving. A heavy silence followed, laden with years of unspoken hurts and recent betrayals. "Who are those kids?" Anne finally asked, her tone a mixture of curiosity and accusation. Thomas turned toward his daughter's voice. "They're Sophie and Claire, and they're the reason I'm here today, alive and determined to correct the mistakes I made with you both." Paul let out a bitter laugh. "Mistakes? You abandoned us, vanished for months, and now you return with two street kids talking about mistakes." "Watch your words, Paul," Thomas warned, his voice dangerously low. "Those street kids, as you call them, have shown me more compassion and love in the last few months than you two have in years." Anne took a hesitant step toward her father. "Dad, sir, you're not thinking clearly. You need help, medical care. You can what, Anne?" Thomas interrupted. "Put me in some facility so you could finally take complete control of the company. Don't think I don't know what you've been up to in my absence." The silence that ensued was deafening. Paul and Anne exchanged nervous looks, the reality of their situation sinking in. "What do you want, Dad?" Paul finally asked, his voice a mix of defeat and defiance. Thomas straightened, exuding the authority he had wielded as a business leader for years. "What I want is simple. I want the truth. I want to know exactly what you did to the company I built. And I want you to understand that from now on, things will change drastically." He paused, letting his words sink in. "But above all, understand this. Sophie and Claire are part of my life now. They will stay here with me. If you have any hope of redemption, of maintaining any connection to this family or this company, You will begin by treating them with the respect they deserve." Anne and Paul remained silent, the weight of the situation finally dawning on them. Their father, who they thought lost forever, was back, and with him, accusations of their questionable actions and two children who seemed to have captured his heart. Thomas, sensing his children's hesitation, softened his expression slightly. "I'm still your father, and despite everything, I still love you, but things have to change. Are you ready for that?" The silence that followed was filled with unspoken emotions and the promise of future confrontations. Blackwell Mansion, once a symbol of success and familial unity, had now become the stage for an impending battle. A battle for redemption, truth, and above all, the real meaning of family. Thomas's office, once a sanctuary of power and business decisions, now carried a tense atmosphere of secrets about to be exposed. Thomas sat behind his old desk, his posture upright, belying the inner turmoil he felt. Anne and Paul, visibly uncomfortable, occupied the chairs before him, while George stood by the door, a silent but watchful presence. "Well," Thomas began, his voice calm yet firm, "I think it's time to lay all our cards on the table. Anne et Paul, I want to hear from you exactly what happened after I lost my sight." Anne spoke first, her voice trembling. "Dad, you have to understand. When you suddenly went blind, we panicked. The company, everything you built, we thought it was all going to collapse." Paul nodded vigorously. "Exactly. We had to act fast to keep things running. Maybe we made some poor judgment calls, but our intentions were good." Thomas tilted his head, skepticism etched on his features. "Poor judgment calls. Is that what you call embezzling company funds and trying to alter my will?" The silence that followed was deafening. Anne and Paul exchanged anxious looks, the severity of the situation finally hitting them. How do you know about that?" Anne stammered. George took a step forward. "I found out," he said simply. "And believe me, I know far more than you imagine." Thomas raised a hand, silencing any protest. "I want the truth. All of it. Now." Paul exhaled deeply, running his hands through his hair in a gesture of defeat. Okay. The truth is, I have debts. Massive gambling debts." Anne turned to her brother, shocked. "Paul, you told me it was just a few thousand. A few million would be more accurate," Paul muttered, avoiding everyone's gaze. Thomas felt as though he'd been punched in the gut. "Millions? Paul, how could you?" I thought I could win it all back," Paul explained desperately. "I just needed one lucky break. But the debts kept growing, and you decided the solution was to steal from your father's company," Thomas finished, disappointment heavy in his voice. Anne, realizing the truth was coming out, made her own confession. "Dad, there's more. The mansion. It's been mortgaged." Thomas turned abruptly toward his daughter. "What? How is that possible without my authorization?" Anne swallowed hard. We forged your signature. It was the only way to get quick money to cover Paul's debts and keep the company afloat." The silence that followed was thick, loaded with betrayal and disillusionment. Thomas felt as if the ground beneath him had vanished. The mansion, the home he had built for his family, now at risk because of his own children's reckless actions. "But that doesn't explain why you abandoned me," Thomas finally said, his voice low and dangerous. "Why try to institutionalize me? Why force me to run away?" Paul and Anne exchanged guilty looks before Paul spoke up. It was part of the plan. They thought if you were out of the way, we could fix everything without you knowing. Then once it was all solved, we'd bring you back." "Bring me back?" Thomas repeated incredulously. "After treating me like an invalid, after depriving me of my freedom?" Anne sobbed quietly. "Dad, we never wanted to hurt you. We were desperate. Paul's debts, the pressure from the board, it felt like everything was collapsing." Thomas was silent for a long moment, absorbing the magnitude of his children's betrayal. When he finally spoke, his voice was charged with anger and deep sadness. "You two, you were my pride, my joy. I built all this for you. And in return, you not only betrayed my trust, but you were willing to cast me aside like a burden. Paul tried to intervene. "Dad, please, you have to understand." "Understand?" Thomas snapped. "What exactly should I understand, Paul? That my son is a compulsive gambler willing to risk everything I built? That my daughter, whom I trusted to help run the company, didn't hesitate to forge my signature and mortgage our home?" Anne began openly crying now. "We made terrible mistakes, Dad. But you vanished. We thought maybe you'd died," Thomas finished bitterly. "And that would have been convenient for you, wouldn't it? All problems solved with a stroke of luck." The silence that followed was crushing. George, who had remained quiet throughout, finally spoke. "Mr. Thomas, perhaps it's time to talk about next steps. The situation is dire, but not beyond repair." Thomas nodded slowly. "You're right, George." As always, he turned to his children, his expression a mix of disappointment and resolve. "From now on, things will change drastically. Paul, you will seek help for your gambling addiction. Anne, you will work with George to undo as much of the damage as possible to the company." He paused, letting his words settle. "And as for the mansion, we'll do what we can to save it. But understand this, Sophie and Claire are my priority now. If we have to sell this house to secure their future, that's exactly what we'll do." Anne and Paul looked stunned, the reality of their actions and the consequences finally sinking in. "Dad," Anne began timidly, "what happens now? To the company? To us?" Thomas took a deep breath. "Now, we begin rebuilding. It won't be easy and it won't be quick. You'll have to earn back my trust and the trust of the board and shareholders. But if you're truly remorseful, if you're willing to work hard to fix what you broke, then maybe, with time, we can be a family again." He rose, signaling the end of the conversation. "Think carefully about what you've said and heard today. Tomorrow, we start the difficult task of repairing the damage you caused." As Anne and Paul left the office, visibly shaken, Thomas turned to George. "Well, my friend, it looks like we have our work cut out for us." George nodded, a small smile on his lips. "Yes, sir. But this time, we'll do it together. Me, you, and two very special little helpers." Thomas smiled for the first time since the conversation began. "Yes, George, together. It's time to redefine what it means to be a Blackwell." The sun set over Blackwell Mansion, casting long shadows through corridors once filled with warmth. Thomas sat in the library, weighed down by the day's revelations. George remained beside him in silence, a comforting presence amid the emotional storm. "George," Thomas finally spoke, his voice weary, "do you think I was really such a terrible father?" George sighed deeply. "No, sir. You always did the best you could. Sometimes children make choices we can't control." Before Thomas could respond, there was a soft knock at the door. Sophie and Claire entered hesitantly, their small faces marked with concern. "Mr. Thomas," Sophie called gently. "Are you okay?" Thomas forced a smile, opening his arms to the girls. "Come here, my little ones." The twins ran to him, snuggling into his embrace. For a moment, Thomas allowed himself to just feel the comfort of their presence, remembering what truly mattered. "Girls," he began gently, "we need to talk about some tough things." Claire looked up at him, her large eyes filled with worry. "Is it about the mansion? We heard Ms. Anne crying in the hallway." Thomas nodded gravely. "Yes, partly. You see, my children, they made some very serious mistakes, and now we all have to deal with the consequences." Sophie frowned. "But that's not fair. You didn't do anything wrong." "Sometimes, sweetheart," George interjected softly, "life isn't fair. But how we deal with those injustices defines who we are." Thomas gave his friend a grateful look before continuing. "George is right, and now we have to make some difficult decisions." He explained as simply as possible about the debts, the mansion's mortgage, and the company's troubles. The twins listened intently, their young faces serious as they tried to understand the situation's complexity. "What will happen next?" Claire asked, her small voice trembling with fear. Thomas took a deep breath. "Well, we have some options. We can try to save the mansion, but that would require using a lot of money we could otherwise use to help other people, and to secure a safer future for you. Sophie and Claire exchanged looks, a silent conversation passing between them. Finally, Sophie spoke. "Mr. Thomas, we don't need a mansion. We just need to stay together." Thomas felt tears welling up in his eyes. "Oh, my dears, you're so wise for being so young." George cleared his throat, moved by the moment. "If I may, sir, perhaps we should consider selling the mansion. With the money, we could buy a smaller, cozier home and use the rest to stabilize the company and start that charity project you've always dreamed of." Thomas mulled it over, the gears of his business mind turning. "You might be right, George. It could be a fresh start for all of us." He turned to the girls. "What do you think? Would you be willing to start a new life in a different home?" Claire gave a timid smile. "As long as we're all together, anywhere can be home." Sophie nodded vigorously. "And we can help other kids like us. That would be wonderful." Thomas felt a surge of pride and love for these two young souls who had entered his life so unexpectedly. "Then it's decided. We'll sell the mansion and start over." He stood, his posture firmer than it had been all day. "George, please call Anne and Paul. We have a lot to discuss and plan." As George left to fetch Thomas's children, Sophie and Claire stayed beside him, offering their silent support. Minutes later, Anne and Paul entered the library, their faces etched with anxiety and guilt. "Dad," Anne began hesitantly, "we—" Thomas raised a hand, silencing her. "Listen carefully, both of you. I've made some decisions. The mansion will be sold." Paul gasped. "But Dad, this house has been in our family for generations." "And it was almost lost due to your reckless actions," Thomas countered firmly. "The money from the sale will be used to settle debts, stabilize the company, and start a charitable foundation to help orphans and families in need." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Both of you will have the chance to redeem yourselves. Paul, you'll seek treatment for your gambling addiction. Anne, you'll work directly with George to fix the damage done to the company. If you prove yourselves trustworthy, over time, you may regain positions of responsibility." Anne and Paul exchanged glances, the enormity of their father's decisions pressing down on them. "What about Sophie and Claire?" Anne asked softly, looking toward the twins. Thomas smiled, drawing the girls closer. "They're part of the family now, part of our future. I hope that with time you'll accept them as your sisters." The silence that followed was steeped in emotion. Finally, Paul spoke, his voice thick with feeling. We'll do our best, Dad, to fix things, to be the family we should have been." Thomas nodded, a faint smile on his lips. "That's all I ask. One day at a time, we'll work together to rebuild not just our fortune, but our family." As the sun finally dipped below the horizon, the Blackwell family, now expanded and transformed, faced an uncertain future, brimming with possibility. United by love, forged in adversity, they took their first steps toward redemption and renewal. The days that followed Anne and Paul's revelations were intense and emotional at Blackwell Mansion. The once grand house, a symbol of wealth and power, now buzzed with a different energy, that of a family struggling to rebuild itself. With George's tireless help, Thomas threw himself into the Herculean task of saving the company and clearing the accumulated debts. Long hours were spent in the office, poring over documents, making calls, and devising strategies. Anne, determined to prove her remorse, shadowed George day and night, learning the ins and outs of the business she had so long neglected. Her dedication was evident, and she was often the first to arrive and the last to leave the office. "Dad," she said one evening, her eyes red from exhaustion but shining with renewed determination, "I found a way to restructure the finance department that could save us millions annually." Thomas smiled, a mixture of pride and relief flooding him. "Excellent work, Anne. Keep it up." Paul, in turn, was fighting his own demons. He enrolled in a rehabilitation program for problem gamblers and began attending regular meetings. The first few weeks were rocky, marked by relapses and moments of weakness, but with surprisingly steadfast support from Sophie and Claire, who showered him with encouraging drawings and kind words, Paul began to make real progress. "You know," Paul said to Thomas one day, as they watched the girls play in the garden, "they make me want to be a better person. It's strange, but they give me hope." Thomas nodded, his heart swelling with love for his two little saviors. "They have that effect on people. Speaking of which, Paul, there's something I need to discuss with you and Anne." That evening, Thomas gathered the whole family in the library. Sophie and Claire, sensing the serious tone, sat quietly, their hands clasped together. "Family," Thomas began, his voice firm but gentle. "These last few weeks have been filled with significant changes. We've confronted our mistakes and weaknesses, and we've worked together toward a better future." He paused, his expression softening as he looked at Sophie and Claire, and in the midst of it all, two very special people brought light into our lives at a time of great darkness. The girls smiled shyly, and Anne and Paul exchanged glances of understanding. "That's why," Thomas continued, "I've made an important decision. I'm going to officially adopt Sophie and Claire." A momentary hush fell over the room, followed by exclamations of surprise and joy. The girls leaped from their seats, throwing themselves into Thomas's arms with tears of happiness. "Really?" Sophie sobbed. "We'll be a real family." Thomas held them tight, his own voice quavering with emotion. "You've always been my family from the moment we met. Now it will be official in the eyes of the law and the world." Anne was the first to approach, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Welcome to the family, officially, little sisters," she said, opening her arms for a hug, which the girls eagerly accepted. Paul, visibly moved, joined the group hug. "I think I've always wanted to be a big brother," he joked, his voice thick with emotion. George watched with teary eyes until Thomas extended his hand, pulling him into the collective embrace. "You're part of this family too, my friend," Thomas said warmly. In the days that followed, news of the pending adoption brought new energy to the mansion and the company's recovery efforts. Anne worked even harder, determined to ensure a stable future for her new sisters. Paula, inspired by the faith Thomas had in him, doubled down on his rehabilitation. The sale of the mansion, once a painful blow, was now viewed with optimism. With George's help, Thomas began searching for a smaller, cozier home that could become the new dwelling place for their expanded family. "How about this one?" George suggested one day, showing a photo of a charming country house on the outskirts of the city. "It's big enough for everyone, has a large garden for the girls to play in, and it's close to an excellent school." Thomas smiled, imagining the sound of the girls' laughter echoing through the corridors of the new house. "It seems perfect, George. Let's take a look." As the family made plans for the future, they bonded even more. Evenings were now filled with family dinners, where everyone shared the day's events. Anne and Paul, once so self-centered, discovered the joy of guiding their new sisters. The road to redemption was long and sometimes difficult. There were days of frustration, moments of doubt, and unexpected hurdles, but with every challenge they overcame, every small victory they celebrated together, their family ties grew stronger. Thomas, observing his family gathered together one night, felt a deep gratitude. The tragedy that had nearly destroyed everything he'd built had instead sparked something far more precious, a truly united family, forged not just by blood, but by love, forgiveness, and hope for the future. The path to redemption was far from over, but the Blackwells were determined to walk it together, one step at a time, with Sophie and Claire lighting the way forward. The sun rose over Blackwell Mansion, its golden rays illuminating the estate that months ago had come perilously close to being lost. The garden, once neglected, now bloomed with new life, mirroring the transformation that had taken place inside the house and in the hearts of its inhabitants. Thomas stood on the balcony, his eyes, which had partially regained the ability to discern shapes and shadows thanks to an innovative treatment, focused on Sophie and Claire dashing across the lawn, their laughter echoing throughout the property. "It still feels like a miracle," George said, joining Thomas on the balcony. Thomas nodded, overwhelmed. "To not just getting some of my sight back, George, but seeing our family reborn, that's the real miracle. The last few months had been an emotional roller coaster. Saving the mansion and the company at times felt like an impossible fight. But Thomas's determination, combined with Anne and Paul's tireless efforts and the unwavering support of George, Sophie, and Claire, proved to be an unstoppable force. Anne appeared, carrying a stack of documents. "Dad!" she called out, a triumphant smile on her face. "I just got confirmation. The last of the debts has been paid off. The company is officially out of danger." Thomas embraced his daughter, pride surging through him. "Excellent job, Anne. We couldn't have done this without you." Paul came out next, looking healthier and more relaxed than he had in years. "I've got good news too. The rehab center offered me a position as a volunteer counselor. They want me to share my experiences with others struggling with addiction." "That's wonderful, Paul," Thomas said, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "I'm very proud of you." The girls, noticing the family gathering on the balcony, ran over to join them. "What's going on?" Sophie asked, eyes gleaming with curiosity. Thomas knelt to their level. "Well, my dears, we have some wonderful news. But first, I have a surprise for you." He gestured to George, who disappeared into the house and returned moments later with an official-looking envelope. Thomas opened it carefully, his heart pounding with excitement. "Sophie, Claire," he began, his voice quivering slightly, "these are the final adoption documents. As of today, legally and in every sense, you are my daughters." The girls were silent for a moment as they absorbed the news. Then they erupted in cries of joy, throwing themselves into Thomas's arms as tears streamed down their faces. Anne and Paul joined the group hug, followed by George, tears glistening in his own eyes. Thomas beckoned him over. "You're part of this family too, my friend," he said, voice thick with emotion. When they finally pulled apart, everyone smiling through their tears, Thomas cleared his throat, regaining his composure. "Now, we have one more thing to celebrate. With the company stable and our finances restored, I've decided to establish a foundation." He paused, gazing at Sophie and Claire with affection. "Inspired by the incredible journey we've had, this foundation will help orphaned children and adults living on the streets. We want to give others the same chance we had to rebuild our lives." Anne and Paul exchanged looks of enthusiastic approval. "That's amazing, Dad," Anne said. "How can we help?" "I'm glad you asked," Thomas smiled. "Anne, I'd like you to head the Foundation's finance department. Your expertise will be invaluable in ensuring the resources are properly used." Anne nodded, eyes shining with gratitude at the trust her father was placing in her. Thomas turned to his son. "Paul, your journey to recovery and your new role as a counselor make you the perfect candidate to lead our rehabilitation and social reintegration programs." Paul swallowed hard, visibly touched. "I'd be honored, Dad." "What about us?" Claire asked, her small voice filled with determination. Thomas grinned, ruffling the girl's hair. "How you two, my dears, will be our most important ambassadors. Your stories, your compassion, and your love will inspire others to believe that change is possible." George cleared his throat, gaining everyone's attention. "If I may interrupt, I've prepared a little brunch to celebrate all this wonderful news." The family moved to the dining room, where a hearty spread awaited them. As they sat down, Thomas looked around, his heart brimming with gratitude. Just a few months ago, he was lost on the streets, blind and hopeless. Now he was surrounded by a loving family, with a renewed purpose and a chance to change others' lives. Raising his glass, Thomas proposed a toast to family, to forgiveness, and to new beginnings. May we always remember that no matter how dark the night, a new dawn always comes. Glasses clinked, accompanied by smiles and mutual expressions of affection. Blackwell Mansion, once a symbol of status and wealth, now pulsed with something far more valuable: love, redemption, and hope. As the family enjoyed their meal, chatting animatedly about future plans and shared dreams, the sun climbed higher in the sky, bathing the house in golden light. It was truly a new dawn for the Blackwells, not just another day, but the beginning of a bright and promising new chapter in their lives. Thomas, watching the laughter and joy around him, felt a profound sense of peace. The journey had been long and hard, but every step, every obstacle had led them to this perfect moment. With Sophie and Claire by his side, Anne and Paul redeemed and strengthened, and loyal George completing the family circle, Thomas knew they would face any future challenge together as the true family they had become. The future, once uncertain and bleak, now shone with infinite possibilities. And together, the Blackwells were ready to embrace it wholeheartedly, carrying with them the most valuable lesson they had learned. The real treasure is not in material possessions, but in love, compassion, and the ability to rise from adversity stronger and more united than ever before.